universiteto protestantų teologijos ekumeninio instituto misiologijos docentas.
He is the assistant professor of missiology of the Ecumenical Institute of the Charles University Prague Protestant Theology Faculty.
That's kind of a long title. We may have a go. Ir man regis, pranešimas yra labai įdomia tema ir tiesą sakant pratęsia mūsų diskusijas vykusias iš ryto, dabar labai smarkiai apie religinį dėmenį, kuris man tada labai tinkamas populizmo temai.
And the presentation should quite thoroughly continue the discussion that we've started this morning by introducing a religious dimension, which, as we've already noticed, is quite prominent in this phenomenon.
That's a naujas. That's a new sound. Ir pavadinimas lietuviškai skamba Išrinktoji rasė, šventoji tauta, Dievo tauta, populizmas ir jo religinės šaknys, ir galite matyti lentoje angliškai.
And the title is here on the board: A Chosen Race, a Holy Nation, God's Own People. Populism and their Religious Roots.
So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. My first time in Nidos and only my second time in Lithuania. I'm a theologian, as you've heard, and we are very happy to write and think about miracles, but we don't do them. So I have not managed to learn Lithuanian in the last couple of days, sorry. I also, maybe just a couple of other points before I start. I am a citizen of two countries, of the Czech Republic and of the United Kingdom, and I have spent quite a bit of time living in, and I write a lot about Brazil, all of which are countries which have considerable experience of populism. So although I'm not going to use too many case examples in what I say, that's all in the background. And I haven't said anything about Lithuania because I know a little bit about Lithuania because I have various friends here, but you can see whether it applies to your context or not. And maybe one final thing, you will have seen that the Queen died yesterday, and it's a kind of interesting reflection on where Britain stands, especially what we were hearing this morning. Britain doesn't have a constitution as such, but it has all sorts of traditions and precedents, and the way in which even the handing on of the throne from the Queen now to King Charles. And the Queen herself is somebody who was, in the last 10 years of her life, her annual address would always contain a lot of kind of Christian messages, but ones which were very inclusive. So that's a different kind of populism. In early December 2017, the Russian Orthodox Council of Archbishops met to celebrate the centenary of the restoration of the office of Patriarch. This had happened during the Moscow Council, which began with incredibly bad timing. It was almost exactly the same time as the Bolshevik Revolution, and briefly promised a very different relationship between a socially engaged church and an autocratic state. 100 years later, and a few days before announcing his candidature for re-election as president, Vladimir Putin came to address the assembled archbishops. Having thanked the church for its service, its support for traditional values, and its spiritual care of the army, he continued. People are looking towards Russia as an example of steadfast traditional values and a normal human life. I believe that in order to respond to the challenges of the future worthily, We must defend justice, truth, and righteousness, preserve our way of life and identity, and take strength from our culture and history and our spiritual and moral foundation. We must advance forward, taking in all that is new and progressive, yet remain to be Russia forever. You can make of that what you will. Patriarch Kirill responded, "In the name of the Council of Archbishops of the Russian Orthodox Church, I would like to wish you, esteemed Vladimir Vladimirovich, a long, healthy life and God's help in implementing the important mission which God Himself granted you by way of the people." So one of my questions, at least in this lecture, is why Kirill is so convinced that his friend, the populist leader Vladimir Vladimirovich, is on a God-given mission. To answer this question, I briefly address populism before moving on to its religious roots in Christian, or more accurately, post-Christian societies. Finally, I return again to Kirill and his support for Putin, as an example of the deep dangers in this messianic vision of the relation between the nation-state and religion. But although I use this particular example of Russia and the war in Ukraine, we should recognize that similar, if hopefully less deadly visions exist in many of our countries. And God is used as an excuse by populist politicians, not only in Russia. Populisms have been around as long as people. But what are they? Cas Mudde, a Dutch political scientist and a leading contemporary scholar of populism, defines populism as a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups: the pure people versus the corrupt elite. We heard a bit about that this morning from Jogila. And which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, the general will of the people. So let's unpack this rich but somewhat dense definition by examining three of its terms in more detail. What is a thin-centered ideology? What does antagonism entail? And what is the will of the people? I'm going to draw here especially on two other writers on populism, the Argentinian Ernesto Leclau and his co-author and wife, the Belgian Chantal Mouffe, whose academic careers have both been in England. I choose these two thinkers, among other reasons, because of their emphasis on populism as the construction of a people. Specifically, I want to look at what kind of people religiously motivated populists are trying to construct. So what is a thin-centered ideology? In talking about populism as a thin-centered ideology, Leclau draws here on a term from the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who talks of the master or empty signifier. Here's an example from Vilnius, which I was really struck by when I was there the other day. The easiest way to understand what a master signifier means is to recall the posters that go up before an election, with pictures of politicians trying to look approachable and trustworthy, and with a 3 or 4 word slogan attached. Things like law and order, or our country for us, or responsible and honest. Or in this case, Vilnius loves Vilnius heart, Ukraine. Vilnius, what does that mean? What is Vilnius? What does love mean? What does a heart mean? All these questions. The point of these slogans is precisely that they have no concrete meaning, but they're capable of being fulfilled with significance by anyone. I mean, if I see that slogan, I understand what it means. Well, I understand what it means. You understand what it means. Whether we both understand the same thing is another question. These signifiers are a rallying point around which people can gather, because each can read into it her or his own needs and desires. And these phrases will often refer to family values, tradition or traditional values, even in some cases Christian values. Such phrases generally serve as a shorthand for negative campaigns against abortion, homosexuality and migrants, especially Muslims. Why this happens is connected to what the Clowen Move argue concerning the construction of a people. This happens around the specific demand or set of demands that lead to claims. In populisms of the left, these demands are usually about improving the life of the poor or excluded. Here, in populisms of the right, it is round the demand for recognition and value that leads to claims to impose one exclusive view of the world on everyone. Both these forms of populism pick up on a sense of dissatisfaction, with people desiring or demanding something that is not present. With so-called Christian values, people are demanding a return to a world they think they knew, one of certainties and clarity. The Chantal Mouffe often speaks of the importance of the affective in populisms, the kind of the emotional, the feeling. Most such positions are indeed an instinctive, affective, emotional response to change that is almost visceral, comes from right deep inside you. Something is not right, even if we can't really name it. And the second point of the definition of populism is to do with antagonism. The Clowen Moufe's first significant work together was entitled Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. For both of them, and especially more recently for Chantal Mouffe, the idea of competing antagonistic or at best agonistic hegemonies as one way of understanding the divisive pools of different populisms has been key. In an interview in 2008, Mouffe explained what she and McClough understood by hegemony. She said, "To speak of hegemony means that every social order is a contingent articulation of power relations that lacks an ultimate rational ground. Society is always the product of a series of practices that attempt to create a certain order in a contingent context. These are the practices that we call hegemonic practices. Things could always be otherwise. Every order is predicated on the exclusion of other possibilities. A particular order is always the expression of a particular configuration of power relations." I admit that the language may be rather abstract, but I hope the meaning is clear. Things could always be otherwise. There is nothing natural and given about any particular political system or choice. And that is why there will always have to be disagreements, clashes of opinion. Every social order, Mouffe says, is a contingent articulation of power relationships that lacks an ultimate rational ground. And it's contingent on many things, not least the particular needs of the time and place. Power relationships change. In the famous proverb, I hope you have this in Lithuanian, but if not, sorry. In the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. But of course, that is a reminder that in the kingdom of the two-eyed, the one-eyed man is at a disadvantage. And in the kingdom without light, the blind may be the advantaged. Power relationships are contingent, depending on needs and conditions. And Mouffe continues, their articulation lacks ultimate rational grounds. That doesn't mean that they're irrational but their basis is also necessarily contingent. And for this very reason, and because, as she says, every order is predicated on the exclusion of other possibilities, there will always be conflicting, antagonistic positions. Basically, politicians will always disagree with one another. At heart, there is an inevitable and ineradicable opposition. Two different visions of what can meet the demands of the people, and of who and what the people can and should be. At one level, this is encouraging. There's nothing wrong with political disagreement, and it need not lead to hatred. Two tennis players, you could think of Venus and Serena Williams, for example, can be friends and still want to defeat each other when they meet on court. And in the end, only one of them can win. But that is an incentive for the other to improve and win the next time. And at one level, that's how democracy works. Competing arguments about how a people should understand itself and organize itself. And neither has ultimate, decisive, rational grounds for acceptance, but therefore neither for dismissal. But many forms of populism, including religious ones, need an enemy, not only to be defeated, but to be humiliated. The non-ultimate is made into an ultimate, because the devil, that is, whoever one considers an enemy, needs to be crushed. The third area of populism I want to just look at briefly is the idea of the will of the people. Populist approaches frequently refer to what they call the will of the people. This general will of the people is placed against what is perceived as the will of an oligarchy, a few, the so-called elite, who run the country for their own interests. Of course, most populist leaders, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Andrej Babiš in my country, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Silvio Berlusconi, Vladimir Putin, etc., are by almost any definition of the word part of the elite. Many of them indeed by more, or normally less, legal ways, extremely rich. But of course that's not really what matters. Many of them are also highly skilled at painting pictures that point to the kind of antagonisms described above, where they put aside their position in the elite to stand with the ordinary people, to help them achieve their own dreams and desires. They give voice to the kind of frustrations felt by such people, who are lost amidst the changes going on around them, and want the return of old certainties, even if those certainties never existed, or if they did, at the time they were rejected. There is also what René Girard calls a mimetic dimension to much of this discourse. If we hear enough times that this is what everyone wants, we want it too, because we learn what we want from the wants and desires of others. The Italian communist leader Antonio Gramsci, imprisoned under Mussolini, introduced the concept of organic intellectuals. He also, by the way, developed the idea of hegemony that the Clow and Mouffe draw on. The organic intellectual can be understood as something like the person in the pub, or perhaps now the person on Facebook or other social media, who explains why migrants are dangerous, why the European Union is to blame for all the problems in the world, and so on. Or they can be the people who refuse to accept these arguments and produce counter-arguments, counter-hegemonies of social change. And thus the will of the people is developed. But, and this is the important point, it can only ever be the will of part of the people, who, however, as Leclau points out, think of themselves as the whole of the people and seek to impose their hegemonic order on all. This brings us back to the antagonistic nature of most populisms. since the people who are constructed around different and competing demands each consider themselves to be the only true people. And as Chantal Mouffe insists, between these two positions there is no common ground. To take an example from my own country of origin, the UK, you cannot find common ground in the debate anyway, between those who voted to leave the EU and those who voted to remain. I mean, there is no common ground, there's no meeting point between those two positions. As soon as binary decisions are involved, yes, no, there is a fundamental antagonism. So given all this, what role does religion play, explicitly or implicitly, in underpinning these populist approaches? And I now turn to that question. The first letter of Peter is probably not the best known book of the New Testament, but it does contain one of the fullest reflections on the identity of the Christian community in relation to God and to the world around them. The first section of the letter ends with a description of what it means to be church, the gathered or chosen of God. And the first move is rather a negative one. Rid yourselves, therefore, of all malice and all guile, insincerity, envy, and all slander. Most populisms of the right or of the left do not include this part, which is the hermeneutic of suspicion that enables us to question our own motives in acting as we do. To engage in this self-questioning is, however, important for the laying of good foundations in order to begin the constructive part of becoming a people. And this is emphasized by the use in 1 Peter of building vocabulary. So the letter talks about living stones to be built into a spiritual house, a cornerstone, a stumbling block. All these are architectural or building images. And a people which is so constructed will become a chosen race, a royal priesthood, I've just realized this was meant to be in Greek, but in transferring it onto here, the Greek font has obviously disappeared. So you'll have to imagine it. Okay. Sorry. Never mind. I will leave aside the royal priesthood to concentrate on the three Greek terms that Peter uses, respectively genos, race, ethnos, nation, and laos, people. The three words are used already in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures, in reference to Israel, its neighbours, and their relation to Israel's God. Today these terms are mainly used as ways to exclude the unwanted other, the migrant, the West, etc. But is this what they really mean, and do they open up other possibilities for constructing a people that embraces and welcomes the other in all her or his variety? All three categories come, of course, with their own prehistory. Ethnos, for example, is often used to refer both to what we might now call species, but also to non-Greek nations. So, for the Christians addressed by the letter, this is an embracing of the potentially denigrating reality imposed on them by the majority, and its use as a self-designator. This happens quite frequently when people are insulted and they take the term of insult and use it as a self-identifier. The adjective holy applied to this group is an assertion of its special place in the eyes of God, and thus a retort to the majority. Genos is sometimes synonymous with ethnos, sometimes more specific, referring to kinship groups, for example. Whilst laos tends to be used to describe the people over against the leaders, and is thus close to the populace that lies lies at the heart of most understandings of populism. In the Septuagint, laos, which is relatively infrequent in classic Greek usage, is a common term normally referring to Israel. The use of the three terms genos, ethnos and laos in one grouping is unique to 1 Peter. As David Horrell, a British New Testament scholar, puts it, the letter uses the terms for establishing the idea that Christian identity is specifically an ethnic or ethno-racial identity, that is, identity as a people, a nation, or a race. And each of these nouns has an accompanying adjective or adjectival phrase. The race, for example, is chosen, which in Greek is eklekton, a word with the same root as ecclesia or church. And the basic meaning of this is to do with being called out. And as with many passive expressions in the New Testament, the implied agent, that is the one by whom they are called out, is God. So it's God who chooses the genos, not vice versa. And there is therefore nothing inherently superior about it. The emphasis is on the God who calls, not on those who are called. And something similar is said about the people, who are a people in the possession, with again the implied subject being God. Thus a people who belong to God. Finally, this race and people is also called a holy nation. The word holy suggests a nation, an ethnos, set aside for God. This ethnos is outside of Israel, but like Israel, it is holy, marked and distinguished by its relationship to God. Holiness is, in religious terms, a category that is both moral and spiritual. Therefore, it requires demonstration in action. For a holy people is only holy if it behaves in a holy way. The actions of the people are not holy because the people is holy, but the people is holy if and only if it acts in a holy way. And the holy way can never be one that harms others. Truly Christian values, then, are necessarily supranational, transcending any given place or race. The people is constructed around its relationship to God, and thus is open to all. But what actually happens in practice is a kind of reversal of this. An already established ethnos sees itself as a chosen race and a holy people because of its relationship to a given place, and understands itself as the final local instantiation of what it is to be Christian. So Christian values are its values. But because the people, as we've said, is always partial, its values cannot be holy, cannot be all-inclusive, and cannot be Christian. They are, in the words of Chantal Mouffe, contingent. Rather, as a chosen race, a holy nation of people set apart for God, the Christian community, in the eyes of 1 Peter, lives between two worlds, so that Peter can also call them aliens and exiles. The words used for aliens and exiles in Greek are paroikoi and parapidemoi. The prefix para, with which both words begin, means something like beside or next to. So paroikoi then means those who live alongside, near to the oikos, the house or household, but more widely the community. It implies the people who live on the margins. They do not have full rights. They are parapidemoi, people from elsewhere living alongside the natives, permanent residents in the kind of legal language we often use today to describe such people. But this very fact means that the task of the Christian community cannot be to offer its full support on religious grounds to the government. It stands to some extent apart, whilst being fully involved in doing good. temptation to identify our partial values with whole and thus wholly Christian or traditional values remains. I put this slide up, slightly naughty, really. Loss of traditional values includes, for Rome, the introduction of Christianity, just as a reminder that what we understand by tradition kind of depends on where we're standing, and what traditional values are changes as much as anything else. So I want now to return to look at what these phrases like Christian or traditional values mean in Russia. And it's easy to dismiss Putin and Kirill as mad and evil. There's very little evidence against the second of those claims, that they're evil. But the first, I think, requires some further probing, since there is at least an internal logic to their position. As is well known, the supportive ideology for Putin's acts of aggression, with the backing of the Patriarch, is that of the Russian world, Ruski Mir. The Russian world is everything and everyone who is considered, at least by the Russian leadership, to come under Russia's sphere of influence, through language, history, but also through religious ties. In many ways, this doctrine is a counterpart of American exceptionalism, suggesting that a particular country, Russia or America, is set apart, a holy nation, with a particular destiny for the world, a chosen race, and belonging to God, God's own people, so that whatever it does is God's will. A writer on messianism and mission in Russian foreign policy, Alexei Zoranovich, notes that for those who embrace the messianic ideal, human history is guided by a higher reason, for example, divine providence or the logic of history. And history is leading to the establishment of a particular ideal, the culmination of which is to implement this ideal and the fact that the chosen one, an individual or a community, has a particular mission to carry out. In short, Messianism is characterized by a linear view of history, by universalism, and by mission. This mission, she goes on to explain, has three characteristic traits. Firstly, a community endowed with a sense of mission is convinced of its exceptional destiny, exceptionalism. This conviction leads to a sense of moral superiority, which is also a component of exceptionalism. And that is the second characteristic of mission. The third characteristic indicates that the community is carrying out a mission not only in its own interest, but for universal benefit, universalism. To ask about mission is to ask about a state's identity, since mission is the projection of a state's identity on the global stage. Mission designates the imperative to act as the particular calling the state has to remold the international order or to protect it from change. A couple of points can be made. Briefly, the Third Rome doctrine, which dates back to the late 15th century, when following the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453, Moscow was the last free center of orthodoxy, makes it very easy for Russia to focus on its messianic mission. Second, all forms of populism, and the idea of messianic mission is a fundamentally populist idea, present themselves, as we have seen, as a counter-hegemonic stance over against some other. And this other, for Russian messianism, is the West. Now clearly the West as an all-embracing concept is a master signifier or an empty signifier. And it really continues a debate that's been at the heart of Russian life since at least the 16th century, between those who later in the 19th century would come to be called the Slavophiles and the Westernizers. Because the Bolsheviks combined the two, the post-communist possibilities in Russia were in some senses open, and the Slavophile choice, the anti-West choice, is perhaps best understood as a pragmatic ideological one. Because if Russia couldn't continue to compete on equal terms, economically and in terms of influence with America, or perhaps even also China, then it had to make America and the rest of the West an enemy again. And the sense of Russian exceptionalism and its mission, its destiny for greatness in the subtitle of Koranovich's book, led to the adoption of the Russian world and Russian idea, firmly supported by the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church. More recently, Kirill has, of course, offered support for the war in Ukraine. The English language version of the Moscow Patriarch website in news when I was writing this paper in mid-June 2022 was full of reports of what it terms schismatics seizing churches in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Kirill himself has blessed those taking part in the war and sought to justify the war as a defense of traditional values and the support of Russians under attack from others, promising God's blessing on the war. And this is, of course, a classic populist move. Traditional values have no concrete meaning, as we have already noted. And to claim that acts of violence are carried out in defense of others aims at creating a supposed enmity. The other is a threat, and the will of the people must be to defend itself against this external enemy. The Church places itself as a defender of traditional values, and as far as I can see, for Kirill this seems mainly to be in opposition to homosexuality. Quite why he is so threatened by gay pride marches, which are hardly the biggest threat to civilization we face as the planet overheats and war rages, is hard to say. And obviously to reduce the idea of the West to legislation permitting the legal recognition of different types of same-sex relationships is highly reductionist. And yet, of course, the power of populism lies not in whether it's right, but in its power to place into concrete and easily graspable images the disquiet and unease that people feel. Most fundamentally, these attacks on the West and the war in Ukraine are given a quasi-religious backing. Russia is the chosen race, the holy nation, with a special relationship to God and a divine mission. Putin ended his address to the Archbishop's Council with the words "Zbogom," a shortened form of the farewell, "Go with God." But for Putin, perhaps, and for Kirill probably, it's a statement of profound conviction that they are with God and God is with them, and that what they are doing is the will of God. The power that comes from believing that they are doing God's will should not be underestimated. Because for the Christian believer, if God wills something, it cannot be withstood. My aim in this lecture has been to show how populist claims frequently have a religious or at least a pseudo-religious base. Misappropriating motifs from the Bible, which I have summarized in the phrases taken from the first letter of Peter, the chosen race, a holy nation, a people set apart for God. These claims reinforce the sense of exceptionalism in a given people or specific segment of a nation. They have an emotive power, which we should not undervalue. And by giving apparently sacrificial meaning to violence, hatred, and exclusion, they give a positive vision to all kinds of evil. Moreover, this religious language imbues the populist leaders with a kind of aura of divine blessing. Putin acts as a defender of traditional Christian values in this vision, not as a desperate thug. and his fellow secret policeman, Patriarch Kirill, without any apparent sense of irony, blesses soldiers and war as instruments of divine intervention. So that's the problem. What can we do about it? Well, if I had the final answer, I'd solve the world's problems, but there are some suggestions at least. We have to recognize that forms of populism will always be present, and they are not easy to combat. First though, populisms are always self-defeating. The thin-centered nature of populist ideology has advantages. The empty or master signifier allows people to make up their own lists of what they do not like. But eventually, that emptiness and thinness proves its undoing. In the famous words attributed to Abraham Lincoln, you can fool some of the people all of the time, all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. Essentially, master signifiers ultimately lose their power to fool anyone. Second, it is important to hold that there is truth. We may indeed not always know what it is in any given situation, but there are lies and there are truths, and a lie spoken often and loudly remains a lie. Donald Trump, for example. Among these lies is the claim that God can ever be used as a justification for nationalist violence. In the foundational text of the Jewish scriptures, where Abraham is chosen by God, the task of the people who will come from him is to be a blessing to the nations. And killing people, literally or metaphorically, is not a form of blessing, and no attempts to justify it make it so. The decision to stand for truth is important in all attempts to combat populism. First, the empty signifier has to be named as such. But that's not enough, and here two factors are important. The first following Leclowen move is to accept that all socio-political visions are populist, inasmuch as they seek to construct a people around a set of demands. In other words, in this understanding, populism is not intrinsically bad or wrong, it's just inevitable. What matters is the kind of populism we support. Second, the fundamental affective dimension of populisms has several consequences. The fact that what we traditionally think of as populist policies, nationalist, exclusive, homophobic, xenophobic, misogynist, and so on, the fact that these appeal to a small but significant part of a population should give us pause for thought. Do we simply write such people off as evil, or at the very best, easy to manipulate? They may be, but the story they hear is one that gives them some hope and some certainty to cling on to amidst change and disruption. I think that's often the real demand around which the people are constructed, the demand for sense and meaning, for security, and for being wanted and needed and valued. These are not at their most fundamental level material needs, even if there is a material element. So any alternative hegemonic construction, any different way of speaking to and for the people, has to provide a narrative that makes better sense and that is more appealing. This narrative needs to offer a sense of hope, of inclusion, of people being valued and needed. It will show how hospitality, the welcoming of the other, understanding of and understanding of difference are among the most traditional of human values. It will also recognize that this hospitality can be abused, and that some values are important to maintain, so that the tyranny of majorities over minorities is not replaced by the tyranny of minorities over majorities. The stories it tells, though, will draw on narratives of solidarity, of how diversity is life-giving, of how loving one's country can make one want to share it with others, not cut them out, and so on. Whether or not people have religious belief, there is some kind of transcendent quality to these stories. But specifically, religious believers can help with all people of goodwill to construct a people that is rooted in its tradition and consequently open to the world around it. The holy nation is the one that is united to God, set apart indeed by God for God, and thus a chosen race. But this choice and this being set apart do not confer special status on a geographical region, certainly not in the New Testament. They rather define a task, a calling. First, this calling is to be a people of God, but it is also to be a people of God for others, to witness not to hatred, exclusion, fear, mistrust, but to new life, to a world where, in the words of St. Paul, there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. That is, to dare dream of a world where racial, gender, or social, we may now add sexual distinctions, are not the defining points of what it is to be human. The oldest biblical representation of the people of God is the people that spends 40 years in the desert on the way to the promised land. The people is formed in this wandering, driven on by the promise that at times seems a foolish dream. And yet, in the end, it happens. The story does not end there, of course, because there are repeated failings, precisely because of forms of populism that encourage hatred and exclusion. But the story is one where, despite these failings, there remains a faithful remnant. The prophet Hosea presents an extended metaphorical narrative of the failings and the faithfulness, the move being from no people to being people. Comparing Israel to a prostitute that bears a son, God will first say, name him Lo-Ami, which means no people in Hebrew. For you are not my people, and I am not your God. But in the end, the faithful remnant moves God to change his mind, and thus he says, I will say to Lo-Ami, no people, you are my people, and he shall say, you are my God. To be the people of God and to be the people of any given country or region is only possible where the people give up on their narrow demands and their hatred and let themselves be led to a land that is promised, but that, as in the Bible, they never fully reach. To construct a religiously rooted populism that is life-giving is to call on traditional values such as truth, faith, hope, and love that never exclude but seek to include. Ultimately, it is to choose not death but life. Thank you.
Ačiū labai už pranešimą.
Thank you so much for this presentation.
Pasinaudodama moderatoriaus teisę, aš užduosiu pirmąjį klausimą.
So I will ask the first question as the moderator.
Iš pranešimo panašu, kad ko žmonėms reikia, tai pasididžiavimo, priklausimo ir tikslo, išskirtinumo.
In the presentation, you said that what the people need is pride, belonging, and sense of meaning.
Those are my words. That's what I've heard. Tai mano klausimas yra tada, kas tai, gerai, dar pratęsim klausimą. Ir jūs taip pat minėjot, kad populizmas būdingas politikai. visai tik skirtingas populizmas skirtingai pasireiškia.
And you have also said that populism is characteristic of all politics. It's just manifested in different ways in different types of politics.
Tai jeigu populizmą laikytume problema,
So if we consider populism to be a problem,
tai ar reikėtų keisti politikus, kad jie suteiktų tai, ko žmonėms reikia, ar turėtume tikėtis, kad žmonėms nebereikės šitų?
then should we change the politicians so that they could provide what the people need, or should we adjust our expectations and hope that people no longer have the needed help?
I suspect the answer is both and. Although I work at the Protestant Theological Faculty, I'm Roman Catholic, so both and is my automatic response to everything. So, first of all, about populism as a universal political reality. This I draw here on Leclerc and Mouffe, who are both post-Marxist. They would describe themselves as post-Marxist. And so they're interested in how you construct a populism of the left, really. So they want to say populism tends to be seen as a problem in Europe for right-wing, the extreme right. And I think they want to say, well, no, if you understand populism as the you don't need to translate.
No,
Okay. Sorry, I was talking.
No, we do just
so that if we see populism as the construction of a people, then all political positions seek to construct a people. You want to build the people in your own image and likeness, to use a biblical reference. And that's always going to be problematic. That's always going to make an idol. Okay? Which is why all political positions, as Mouffe says, are things can be otherwise. They're all contingent. And so I think the politicians, we need to change our politicians. I mean, if we need to change our politicians, then we're the people who do that by becoming politicians. I mean, you can't go to the supermarket and pick them off a shelf and, you know, get an upgraded politician 2.0 or something. So you need, I think one of the things that the people need to do if they want better politicians is to encourage better politicians, and not just to, you know, we spend so much time complaining about our politicians, but well, they're doing it and we're not. So if we're not doing it, then we can't complain. So we have to do it ourselves. I think also encouraging, I mean, what do people want? And it's not always offering people what they want, it's offering them a vision of what they could be. And I think maybe that's the important thing. And what I'm suggesting, I think, or trying to suggest, is that if you want to draw on Christian values, then Christian values can offer you a possibility of something which goes beyond a narrow understanding of this is ours and we're going to keep it. Because most politicians who refer to Christian values, you wonder, well, I wonder, what kind of form of Christianity they're talking about, because they usually, it's either one or two issues, which is single issue politics, which has its role but it's not enough. I mean, you know, I don't know, being against whatever isn't going to pay for our gas bills this winter. I mean, being against gay marriage, whether that's right or wrong, I mean, it doesn't matter, but that's not actually going to help make me warm this summer, this winter. So we need people who look at more than one thing at a time. I don't think I answered your question, I'm sorry.
I don't know there's a correct answer. to that kind of question. Bet norėčiau suteikti jums galimybę užduoti klausimą.
Yes, I'd like to encourage the rest of you to join in with your questions.
Aš norėčiau paklausti gal ne tiek teologiškai, o greičiau politiškai.
My question concerns theology less so than politics.
Norėčiau paklausti, kadangi yra iš dviejų šalių atstovas.
Since you're a representative of two countries,
Kiek, jo nuomonė čia, aš manau, kad mums stinga tokios informacijos, kiek, sakykime, religinis populizmas yra aktualus Čekijai ir kiek jis yra aktualus Didžiajai Britanijai ir apskritai tai yra tema. Sakysim, Rusijoje tai tikrai yra tema, Lenkijoje tai yra tikrai tema, Lietuvoje turbūt yra tema. Man įdomu Čekija ir Britanija.
To what extent would you say this religious populism is at all relevant in the Czech Republic and the United Kingdom, the way it is, for example, relevant and even prominent in Poland or Russia, Orthodox Russia, and in Lithuania to probably a lesser extent, but still a little bit. So is that a thing in both of your countries?
Yeah. So yes, I'm happy to be a citizen of two countries. I don't think they'd want me as their representative either of them. It's interesting. I think in Britain it's not religious. Well, by and large, religious Christians in Britain would be anti-populist. I mean, they would be anti people like Boris Johnson and that kind of person. And they're often criticised for that. So they suffer a lot of abuse from political leaders. So Britain is a country where, I mean, still a significant number of people would claim to belong to a Christian church, but where I don't think people who would hold Christian values would be opposed to the government. They would be pro-migrant and more open, anti-Brexit, and all these kinds of, all the non-populist policies, or their populism would be different. The Czech Republic is more interesting. The Czech Republic is generally claimed to be one of the most kind of atheist countries in Europe, which is not true. It has a very low percentage of people who claim to belong to a church. So it's anti-institutional religion. But it's actually very hard to find an atheist in the Czech Republic. I mean, they all pray and they might not call it God, but they believe in something. So, I mean, it's quite a complex thing. And there is a segment of the church, and I don't know, that may be true here as well, which would be very supportive of populist politics. So our former Archbishop and Cardinal in Prague, who just retired, became, over the last 10 years, very supportive of the far-right parties, and very anti-migrant and anti-everything, really. And he represented a part of the church, and not an insignificant part of the church. We've had several experiences of this. We did quite a lot of work in 2015, 2016, when the Syrian refugees were being rejected by the Czech Republic, and we received quite a lot of abuse from various Christians who said, you know, how can you possibly let these people come here because they're Muslims and they're going to destroy Christianity and all our values. the Christian value of excluding the other and not allowing migrants. And I don't know what part of the Bible that was in. But, so there would be, in Czech Republic it would be much stronger, I think. There would be a much stronger part, the the right-wing populism. If you look at populism more broadly, I was saying earlier, it's very interesting. So our current government, which is, I guess, centre-right, more than half of the members of the cabinet are practicing Christians from different churches, mainly Catholic, and I mean that can mean many things, but in this case, I'd say it's quite positive because I think they're actually honest people. They're not corrupt, and they have a genuine desire to serve and help the country. So Christianity can be used in both cases in the Czech Republic. In Britain, it's largely irrelevant.
Aš gal galiu pratęsti klausimą, ar nėra taip, kad populizmas arba antipozicija pirmiausia yra būdas išlaikyti statusą arba politinėje valdžioje arba bažnyčioje.
To continue along the same lines, isn't it the case that this populism or this anti-everything position is really a means to maintain power and status either in the state or in the church?
Yeah, I think, and I think this is one of the real ironies of most forms of populism. This this anti-elitist rhetoric, which is entirely for the support of an elite. I mean, you can't get much more elite than Putin in Russia, or our former Prime Minister Andrej Babiš in Czech Republic. He owns half of the country. Well, not quite, but I mean, a lot of the country. Putin owns probably 90% of Russia. I mean, these people are the elite, and they use this language to maintain the status quo. So, in a sense, I mean, to call them populists is a misnomer, actually. They're not really populists at all. I mean, they're totalitarian. And I think there are genuine populist leaders, I think, in
Latin America.
Sorry?
In Latin America?
Well, even in Europe. I mean, you don't have to like their policies. I don't, but I mean, Salvini in Italy, for example, and even the leader of our far right party, Tomio Okamura in the Czech Republic. He's the son of his father was Japanese, and he's anti-migrant. And kind of the logic. Sometimes I think if some of these people just went to a psychologist or a therapist, they save us all a lot of pain. But anyway, that's another point.
Galimybė klausimams.
Tai pirmiausia, labai ačiū, kad atvykote pas mus ir už labai įdomų pranešimą.
So first of all, thank you very much for coming here and for a very interesting presentation.
Ir įdomu buvo man klausytis, kad jūs mums, paprastiems žmonėms, suteikėte daug atsakomybės.
It was very interesting to hear that you're providing us, the regular people, with a great responsibility.
Mes turime teisingus politikus rinkti, mes turime rūpintis tiesą nuo netiesos atskirti, tikrai sutinku labai.
We must take care to elect the right politicians, and we must figure out how to tell truth from lies.
Bet aš noriu truputį permesti kamuoliuką jiems. Aš noriu paklausti jūsų, kaip jums atrodo, mes matome Kirilo vaidmenį tiesiog pasibaisėtiną istorijoje, šiandienoje, ne šiaip populizmą, tai yra pasibaisėtinas Kirilo vaidmuo ir elgesys.
I wanted to ask your opinion about the role of Kirill.
Ne, aš ne apie Kirilą noriu paklausti. Aš noriu pasakyti, kad vieną religinį lyderį mes matome, kuris atlieka baisų darbą šiame pasaulyje. Mano klausimas būtų, kaip jūs matote kitus šiandien pasaulio religinius lyderius, kaip jūs matote? Ar jie taip turi tylėti kaip tyli, ar jie netyli, ar yra atsvara, ar yra pozityvo, tai žodžiu, tai mes paprasti žmonės supratom, ką reikia daryti. Bet ką jūs manot apie tuos lyderius, kitus religinius lyderius?
So we see Kirill as the example of a religious leader who's playing an outrageous role in history and in the whole political situation and so on. But what do you think about every other religious leader, what they could do to counteract that, or what could be the right role for them? So basically not just responsibility of the regular people, but of religious leaders as well.
Thank you. Yeah. First of all, yes, I think we all have a responsibility, and I think it isn't. Things won't change unless we change them. So I mean, I do think that's important, and it is a big responsibility for all of us. But I mean, it's also true that some people have more direct power to change things than others. I think the role of religious leaders, is certainly to speak the truth. To speak the truth of the Christian religious leaders, to speak the truth of the gospel. And that isn't so difficult. I mean, it's difficult sometimes knowing what the truth is, in some more complex areas about what economic policies we should adopt and those kind of questions. So, or even what form of international relations we should have and who should be our allies and these things. They are more complex. I think but as I said, you cannot ever say that God supports war, and you can't say that in Ukraine either. I mean, you can say that it's justified for people to defend their country, and I think you can say that, and I have no problem with that. But you can't say God therefore wants war. God doesn't want war. And there's nowhere in the New Testament that you can say God wants war. He says they will bring division, and Jesus says he will bring division. That's true. But he doesn't say this is a good thing. He just says this is what will happen. And I think to move from this will happen to we should create conditions for this to happen is always wrong. So I think religious leaders have to say to Kirill, no, the war is wrong. You can't bless the war. You can't bless the soldiers. You are not defending any values by doing this. Certainly not Christian values, not religious values, not human values. And I think in different ways that the religious leaders I've heard talking are trying to do that. I think Pope Francis is trying to do that, although I know some people are critical of what he says, but I think he's trying to do it in a way which says, what you are doing is wrong, but you are still my brother. And now, some people will say, well, he's not your brother, so kick him out your family. And he would say, no, my Christian duty is to say he is my brother. Now, you can make your own choice on that. So I think religious leaders have to tell Kirill no, very simply.
mentioned in the beginning of your slides Jacques, and you mentioned the term empty signifier, which is itself a bit, the term itself is empty signifier, because it means something that cannot be defined, and with the terms like that, you know, psychoanalysis is very easy to, that you can interpret everything with it. So, let's say someone like Zizek, he's a quite symptomatic case in that region, because everything for him is ideology. A chair can be ideology, a lamb. So what actually my question is more or less a bit answered by the last question, is that wouldn't you say that populism is more, the title of the talk should be secular roots of populism, because psychoanalysis, as the empty signifier case, it's they explain everything that is not rational in the religious terms. But Christianity itself is very rational religion. So wouldn't you agree? And just what you said, that everything that is done by Kirill and others is not Christian and not religion. So wouldn't you make a case that populism is more or less secular thing? Just finishing by the example of Czech. So they were quite sad that a few years ago Estonia became more atheistic country, which has like 52 people who declare that they're atheists. At the same time, there's 40% of people who believe in reincarnation. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't know that Christianity or Christian faith is a fundamentally, I mean, you can give reason for your faith in Christianity. It doesn't mean Christianity is a fundamentally rational, or reason is not necessarily the foundation of Christianity. I mean, faith is the foundation of Christian faith, and faith is not irrational, but it can transcend reason. I mean, you can't reduce it to a list of reasons. I mean, famously, if you're in love with someone, you can't reduce it, you can't reduce it to a list of reasons. You can give reasons for it, say, I love this person because, but, because, but you still haven't, that doesn't sum everything up. So Christianity, religious faith, religious belief is not, in the words of Chantal Mouffe, there's no ultimate rational foundation for religious faith. I mean, it has to be a step of faith, which is, and then when you've made that step of faith, then you can give reasons for it. So, in that sense, I mean, religion can be at the heart of populism. And populism, of course, there is a secular dimension to it as well. But for religious believers, and in places like Russia, but not only, I think in many places, this appeal to Christianity. And my question is really, why do you find so many Christians who support populist policies?
Because of bad Christians.
Well, that's the easy answer. But it must be because there is something in there's a warped understanding of what Christianity is. I mean, they are bad Christians, I agree, but because they have an understanding of what Christianity is that allows them to see populism as somehow answering their needs as Christians. So they say, they hear what people say, and people defending Christian values. And some of the people who defend Christian values probably sincerely believe they are defending Christian values. And yeah, I mean, the other way of looking at it is to say, well, I mean, the family or regard for life or being opposed to certain forms of economic exploitation. I mean, these are not impossible to justify from a Christian perspective. I mean, the question is whether you stop there and then exclude everything, and then say it's always a limited form of Christianity. And precisely, I mean, the images that I've been using, or the themes of the chosen race, the holy nation, and God's own people, is precisely when you restrict that to yourself, and you restrict that to a particular geographical locality. So in the Czech Republic, one of the parties always has, Czech Republic for the Czechs. I mean, as if kind of, the idea that a particular bit of land is somehow sacred, and a particular people is somehow sacred, because they live on that land or were born on that land. That's not Christianity, but it's using Christianity as a justification for what you do.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Very interesting speech. So I think that Populist is not about Christianity, that's about church as a power holder institution which power struggles all the time. Yeah? Sometimes in some countries it's very far away from Christian values actually. Another thing, association which I have, if we are looking for roots in Christianity, then probably this binary division on evil and divine, or probably this split which is in the ideology itself, probably that creates fertile soil for populists, for being influenced by populism.
Thank you. I think that point about the church is an important one. That the problem is often the reality, and frequently the voices who are behind the support for populists policies are, especially exclusive populist policies, are churches, church leaders. And then other Christians pick up what the church leaders say. So I think that's important. It's a bit like the discussion this morning about the role of the church in different places that's going on. So yeah, thank you.
Also teaching obedience, probably this is also a key.
Yes, obedience. That you should be. It's a bit complicated. So the passage in 1 Peter, between the bit I took, the chosen race, the holy nation, and the Christians as aliens and exiles, there's a whole passage about being obedient to the emperor, which I haven't gone into. I have a long footnote about it in my written text, but and that's quite problematic in certain understandings of the church and what it means to be obedient to the emperor. But the ultimate category is always about give honor to God. So being obedient to the emperor is within the context of giving honor to God. So if it gives honor to God to be obedient to the emperor, be obedient to the emperor. But if the emperor is anti-God, then you'll no longer have to be obedient to the emperor. But it's complicated. You're right.